Welcome to Culture Crush with me, your host, Dan Dowman, where we get to meet some of the world's leading culture shapers, future makers, and power shakers. Today's episode is brought to you by Anthem, and as always, we'll be talking groundbreaking cultures, leadership challenges, and what you can do about them. Today, I'm joined by culture shaper Danny Wareham. And Danny, from one Dan to another, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks very much, Dan. It's always a privilege to speak to you. I learn so much just from our chats.
Now, we've become new friends and you've been very patient with me whilst I've been battling COVID and cancelling calls and all that kind of stuff. So thank you for bearing with me and giving me some much needed recovery time. I want to do some Hebrew with you, right? Because I've been on your website and I've been looking at the business name and doing a bit of research. And your company, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, is Fergoon?
Close enough, yeah. It's kind of a weird, it's between fear and fur, because it's a non-English word, and gun. So Fergoon.
Okay. Tell us about that, because that is, when I'm meeting guests, like normally, they've got variations on pretty ordinary names, whereas I wasn't expecting some Hebrew to crop up in my life this week. So talk to me about what that means and why you chose it.
So I'm a psychologist, and a lot of the work that I do is heavily reliant on language. Language informs how we think. Now, there are some words that don't have a direct English translation, and therefore, if there are words in one language that don't have a translation, then it follows that people who speak that language natively maybe think slightly differently. So I collect words that don't have direct English translations. And a couple of my favorites are sobremesa, which is Spanish. That was a terrible Spanish accent, which is to have conversations after dinner across the table, that kind of when the restaurant's closed down. And Fergoon is one of those from Hebrew, and it means to take sincere joy and delight in somebody else's accomplishments or experiences. And it's that oxytocin, warm, fuzzy feeling that we get when we see somebody do a good deed for somebody else. And I think the world would be a much better place if everybody was more aware of it and became a cheerleader for everybody else.
I love that. And I love that Spanish word about the conversations across the table. And I'm sure you've seen this because this is one of those viral videos that got shown to me many times over. I'm not really sure why, because I'm not a particular language nut. But there was that TED talk where somebody was talking about, like, if I knocked over a vase in English, you might say, I broke the vase.
Yes.
Or vase. I'm not sure I'm using an American diction on this. But I broke the vase. Whereas I'm not sure, it might be actually in Spanish, you don't use, your sentence structure doesn't work in the same way. So you would just say the vase broke.
Yes.
You wouldn't say I broke it. You wouldn't take ownership of that moment in that way. And again, because you don't have that kind of sentence structure or vernacular, it changes how you view ownership over certain events. So inevitably, really dramatically affects how people engage with those moments of mistake or error or guilt or whatever.
Yeah. The sort of syntax and structure of sentences is interesting, because if you take something like French, so if I wanted to ask you to sit down, I'd say, do you want a seat, or sit down, please? Whereas asseyez-vous in French is you sit. So when you have a native French speaker that's just learning English, if they say to you, you sit, it sounds aggressive and it sounds confrontational, but it's not. It's just because they've translated directly from their syntax straight across to ours. And there's so much nuance in language, even English to English speakers, that gets lost in communication and misunderstood. And that's what a lot of psychology, particularly personality psychology, is based around, because words matter, syntax matter, grammar matters. And they give us a little bit of a window into people's cognition, their actions and their behaviors and the motives behind those behaviors and actions.
It's interesting. We were talking just before we jumped on this call about different personality types and the different frameworks and tools you can use to discover what kind of personality you are. And you framed it really well to me, that those kind of things are great conversation starters. They're not necessarily great destinations. And how many times in the world of business do we see people, once they've got a label they can kind of cling to, they use it to give permission to all sorts of negative behavior traits, like I just tell it like it is, or I'm an OBS person.
Yeah, that's such a red thing to say. We do like labels, that we won't necessarily get into kind of status and so on, but people have a way of identifying who they are and looking for meaning. And if you take things like psychometrics, I mean, the earliest psychometric is the horoscope. One question, what day were you born? And that then determines one of sort of 12 personalities. Now, we all know that the horoscope is rubbish in terms of scientific validity and reliability, yet it's published in every single magazine and every single newspaper, and people still give it credence of, I'm a Leo, I'm thinking of dating a Taurus, are we compatible? And for me, it's not that the tool is, there's no point kind of rubbishing the tool and poo-pooing the tool, because the real benefit isn't in the label that the tool produces, i.e. you're a Taurus. It's in the discussion of, why do you think you've got Taurian traits? Why do you feel stubborn but dependable, etc.? And a lot of other psychometric tools, whether it be kind of Myers-Briggs or DISC or Insights, etc., no tool is completely perfect. It has to be used for the right thing in the right context, the right purpose. But the real magic is in the conversation, in the language that happens afterwards.
Such a fascinating conversation. I think we weren't planning to talk about syntax and language and personality types, but I am for a moment still stuck on Hebrew. I presume you know that your name, Daniel, is a Hebrew name and what it means?
I believe it means courage, and it's linked to the story of Daniel and the lion in the Bible.
Well, interestingly enough, the L at the end of your name is a reference to God in the Hebrew language. And I think it actually means God is my judge, or God has judged favorably. So maybe that's a bit of homework for you to kind of go and have another look.
I prefer Danny, so do I lose anything by losing the L?
I mean, probably technically from a purist language point of view, yes. but let's pick that up. Let's pick that up in another conversation, because I'd gladly dive into our shared name heritage together. Now, one of the things I saw on your LinkedIn business page, not your personal profile, but your page profile for the business, was this. I really love this sentence. I'm just going to read it back to you. That culture is like the wind. It either blows with us, helping us towards those objectives, or it might blow against us, making everything a little bit harder. Mm-hmm. And I love that, because it does echo some of the conversations that we've been having over the last few weeks about every company is experiencing a version of culture all the time. And it's down to leaders, employees, people to take ownership of that story and to try and influence it positively. Because if you don't try and influence it positively in the right direction, you're still going to have culture. It just might be culture that's working against you. Tell us a little bit more about your thinking behind such a beautifully simple little paragraph, but tell us a bit more about that.
One of the challenges I see is that the perception of culture is that it's quite abstract and ambiguous, and it's a bit sort of metaphorical, and we can't get our hands around it. And the second is that this notion of good and bad culture, that there's good and bad cultures. So therefore, to have a good culture, we need to create a place that's fun and energetic, etc. And I struggle with these, because I see culture as a tool, as a strategic tool. It either encourages the behavior that supports your organizational strategy or supports your goals, or it doesn't. So in that sense, it's not good nor bad, it's matched or mismatched. And a quick example might be if you have a culture that we'll call a clan culture. So this is high specialization. So you're not going to do much, but you're going to do it really well. Low opacity. So you only really know what's going on in your team. There's not a lot of interdepartmental working. So you create silos. But high trust. So I trust the people around me are going to do what they're going to do, so I can concentrate on what I'm doing. that's a really great culture. If you're in crisis management, if you're in the armed forces, that's a perfect environment, a perfect culture to drive the behaviors that you need. If you put that into Google, you stop all innovation. So it's not the right culture there. But on the flip side, if you take Google's let's try things and fail fast and put that in the army, then some borders are going to change. So it's not good or bad, it's contextual, and how do you find the right one for you? And the metaphor that I use of culture being like the wind kind of marries those two things together, that it feels a bit kind of invisible. It feels like the current on the ocean or the wind in the air. But if you don't know where you're going, if you don't know what it is that you're trying to achieve, then how do you know whether that wind is going with you or not? And how do you encourage the right behaviors rather than throwing pizza Fridays and bean bags and, dogs in the office and all that kind of stuff at the problem? Where are you heading? And then what will help you develop the culture, the behaviors, the actions, the decision-making, the risk appetite, and everything else that you need that helps you towards that North Star, that helps you on that journey?
I think that's such a lovely and useful way of putting it. That contrast between Google and the army is such a great illustration of why you need a situational lens on what you're trying to do with your culture. And one of the things that I talk about often in my work at Anthem, I think you've got a similar thing with organizational values, where lots of people have a negative relationship with values, or, you'll hear it said often in workplace, like we have these values, but they don't mean anything or do anything. And one of the things I've been talking about recently is thinking more thoroughly about situational values, because sometimes you might have this overarching statement like work as a team.
Yeah.
But if you're going through an organizational restructure and half the team's being made redundant, that makes working as a team really, really difficult for almost everybody, right?
Yeah.
So you might think, through using a situational lens that you were just talking to us about, you might think, okay, so what would, in the current climate, acknowledging the difficult phase that we're in, what does working as a team look like today, right now? And it might mean things like, giving everybody an extra 15-minute break so they can get out the office, clear their head, and recenter. It may be things like, when we have a meeting, we're going to be really upfront and honest about some of the challenges that we face, and we're going to give people an opportunity to vent for 5 minutes, right? I'm not saying that everybody should try this, because again, you have to think about your situation to think what's appropriate. But you can translate certain behaviors that you want to see, like playing as a team, into quite complicated context when you start thinking through that situational lens. And one of the things that I'm often talking about is, what is your intention? Like, what's the thing that you're trying to do and get done? And then what's the associated action that goes with it? Because lots of companies, you end up with statements about who we want to be, but then not really ever translating that into the how we actually do those things. And what I think tends to happen is, when you've got nice statements that don't show up in behavior or aren't mapped to behaviors or actions or things that we actually do, that's not a pathway to but it is a pathway to negative culture or problematic culture.
Yeah. Mismatched
culture. Yeah. One of the ways that I've been talking about that is you sort of end up with propaganda, where what you say doesn't really exist in the real world through the behaviors and actions. And so, I'm sort of driving a wedge at the moment between the word culture, which I think people have like quite a positive outlook on, and not always rightly so, it's not always useful, and propaganda, which is really just where you've got culture, where you've got that mismatch.
For me, culture it's the everyday experience, the everyday behaviors. So it's not the leadership, it's not the processes, it's not the one-off awards, it's everything, but it's often the mundane. It's the performative day-to-day. It's just how we get things done here, as Dweck would say. And when it comes to values, I'm not a fan of values personally, because for the things that you've highlighted is they miss the context. And there's two sides to this. One is, if I said I had a value of honesty, I'm always honest, and I've got great integrity. If my partner, so both of us through COVID put on a lot of weight. If my partner asks, how do I look? Do I stay true to my value and my integrity and tell the truth and damage the relationship? Values are not virtues. They're not necessarily good things. I have a personal value around politeness. You should use your please and thank yous. But I know that because it's such an ingrained value in me, that if I let somebody pull out of a side street or they don't say thank you, I viscerally get angry and I want to chase them down and cut them up in the next bit of traffic. And that is an irrational response. And then the second issue is that they're subjective to you as well. I've got a friend who's Kiwi, and she told me that leaning against any surface that food is prepared or served on is seen as discourteous in New Zealand. And yet how often do we spent lots of money in our contact center environments, etc., creating leaning posts and places to grab a quick sandwich and so on. If we have a value of respect, whose respect are we on about? Are we on about the majority that don't mind leaning against a post and eating a sandwich whilst they have a chat? Or people that in their culture see that as disrespectful? So for me, values are they're not virtues. They're not something to be held up to as something to aspire to. What we really need is, what do you need me to do? How do you want me to behave? How should this inform my actions so that I help the social group perform? I help our organization achieve its goals.
Of course, when people use the term values, they're just trying to kind of create a vernacular, right? I guess the intention, if we were to kind of track back through the use of the term values in organizations, it's an attempt to try and codify and draw out a set of common traits in a group of people, right?
You've hit the nail on the head. They came about in the late 70s and they were championed by McKinsey. But there were plenty of successful, great cultured, inventive organizations before the 1970s. So we don't need the vernacular. It does help to kind of codify and give us some structure, but the challenge is they can become weaponized. Because when that's not the lived experience, if you have a value of integrity or a value of openness, and then the salary is not on your job descriptions, people go, well, that one piece of evidence, I thought we were open and honest, that's incongruent with that. Therefore, I'm going to use it as a weapon. So the important thing is the behaviors. It's always the behaviors. We are what we do.
We're enjoying a very interesting and kind of unplanned territory, which I think is probably good for us both and our listeners today. But I will kind of bring us back to some of our core themes in a moment. But what you were just saying is quite interesting about not seeing like salaries on job descriptions, things like that, and those things being counter to some of the declared values. I would again say you probably got a bit of a propaganda situation evolving there. Because the third part of the Anthem model, I've already talked about intentions and actions. Right, the last piece of that is outcomes. Right, so if somebody can map things like, I can see I'm a job applicant and I can see some real honesty. So I can see that the organization has a behavior of practicing openness about information, which directs me back to one of the things that they say about themselves. Then all of a sudden, there's a real story there that person can believe in because they've got the intention, they've got the action, and the outcome is that person being able to see that information. And I would encourage all leaders to be thinking often about intention, action, and outcome as a virtuous cycle in a way. And on that word of virtue, if we were you and I, going to run an event that says that organizational values are dead, or something like that, just to really get people's attention. Do you think there is sense in talking about organizational virtues instead, like shared virtues as opposed to shared values? Like, is there a better terminology that has more flexibility? Because people don't really talk about, people will talk about personal values quite often, quite regularly, but virtues are sort of one step removed in terms of our language and how we sort of interface with that part of the English lexicon, right? And do you think something like organizational virtues would be more helpful in helping people approach these kind of subjects?
I think it's a really interesting point because the language does matter. And in my mind, virtues conjure up an almost religious context of something that you're aspiring to be. But there is a risk that we simply replace apples with oranges, that they still end up with the same 5 words written on the wall behind reception, when what really matters is the behaviors. And culture is a social phenomenon. We get it in every social group. Families don't have values written on their kitchen wall or virtues written on their kitchen wall. There's this implicit, this is how we get things done here, that kind of sets the tone, that sets the culture for that particular social group. So to come back to your point, I'm not sure initially the actual word will make a huge amount of difference. It's the motive behind the word. What is it that we're trying to do? And that's those implicit, how does a group survive, which is one definition of culture. How do we get things done around here? But more importantly, how do we get things done around here towards a purposeful goal? And it's often that connection that's missing. And we end up with creating a kind of commune. Everybody gets along. We all sing Kumbaya. We have beanbag furniture. Okay, well, when the beanbag furniture and the pizzas are gone, do we still have the behaviors that help us achieve success? Or is it just let's throw something else into the mix next time? Let's have another incentive, another uniform refresh, another social media strategy.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating, we could probably spend all of our time just kind of...
This is a 4-hour podcast, right, isn't it, Gal?
Exactly. Everybody settle in. We're in it for the long haul. But I sort of wonder if, you mentioned before, like when we talk about values, people end up with 5 words on a wall. And I think people's relationship with the word is so saddled with expectation about what that means. You could give almost any HR team in any business in the world and say, go and make us some new values. And, I'm not saying this is true for all of them, but I would expect that an average response would be like a set of 5 short statements that are pretty similar to 99% of other businesses around the world. Whereas I think if you set a challenge that said, I need you to go away and think about, draft 5 aspirational virtues, I wonder if just by taking away that word that's saddled with so much expectation and it almost has a template already attached to it, introducing a new word is kind of saying start from a different place. It'd be really interesting to see what those teams, you could almost do like a study around asking one group of people to create values and one group of people to write virtues and see how they come out. Maybe we should do an experiment together, but who knows? I promised I'd move us on.
That's part of that. Just on values, by the way, that stat, I think it was Deloitte that did a study about 5 years ago, and they found that 95% of their subjects, their companies, shared one of 20 values. So there were 20 key words. 95% of companies used a selection of those words. So yeah, there is a bit of how many companies need integrity or respect or vision or customer obsession.
Yeah. Well, I've got some ideas brewing. So, be prepared to after our 4 minutes. Yeah, after our 4-hour episode's finished, be prepared to stay on for the next 20 minutes from there. Anyway, culture crush, that is the main reason why we're both here. And I know that you've been thinking about a couple of organizations that really fit the bill. And as I often say, when one of my guests selects a culture crush, you're not endorsing a whole organization or like everything that a person is. It's really that you're noticing certain things that you think are worth celebrating that other people should pay attention to. So tell us about your culture crushes and why you've chosen them.
My view of culture, as we've hopefully established, is a little bit different to how the majority seem to view it. I position it as a strategic tool that helps you purposefully achieve the behaviors that achieve your success. So my culture crushes are using culture and using the environment and their processes and their protocols in a way that purposely supports their organizational goals. And the first is an organization called Automattic, who are a behemoth of a company. They're a huge company. They actually own the WordPress platform, the .com, not the free open source software. And they operate across more than 100 countries. They're 100% remote. They've got nearly 100 languages that they speak. And their vision is all about empowering people to be the best creative writers they can. They do all of their interviews via SMS, via text message. Mm-hmm. There's never any face-to-face. There's never any, let's get together as a group and build spaghetti and marshmallow bridges. Never any of that stuff. And actually, when you realize that their vision, their North Star is all about creating these tools and these approaches to make you a better writer, it makes absolute sense that they would recruit via writing. The fact they have multiple languages and that they have to be able to provide information and communicate succinctly, often in bullet points, in just a few words, that changing your talent attraction and your recruitment processes to use that as a tool, I think is genius, because it's so congruent with what you say you're about. The alternative would be that they do, face-to-face Zoom meetings, and then you have another panel interview, and then you get into the place of employment, and now we've got to retrain you for the skills that we actually need for the role. So I admire Automattic for walking their talk.
Yeah, really, really interesting.
And my second one is a local company. They're about 50 miles from where I am, and they're a recruitment company called SF Recruitment. And in the UK, recruitment is quite a male-dominated environment. It's got a kind of work hard, play hard kind of lads type mentality around it broadly. And this organization is entirely female led. And one of the things that I admire about them is they have no job descriptions. What they've done is they've gone to each individual employee and helped them understand when are they at their best. They've then removed the parts of the roles that they're not great at so they can do more of the things they're great at, and created bespoke job descriptions for each employee. If you play that through, that then has impacts on your talent attraction, because now you know that you're recruiting for certain skills that are lacking in your current cohort and demography. It also changes succession planning and development through the business, because now you're not going from junior recruiter to senior recruiter to operational recruiter, etc., in that sort of traditional linear hierarchical model. Instead, it's when are you at your best? Well, actually, those skills are transferable, perhaps to a completely different area of the business. So in metaphorical terms, it's like having a football team. You need a left winger. You don't go out and buy a goalkeeper and then try and mold them into becoming a left winger. And you don't force your current left wingers to go and play in goal. You find out when do you play your best position, and then how do we create a role for that? And I really quite admire that. That's taking job crafting to another level.
Yeah, I mean, what an interesting approach. I mean, but two really, really interesting approaches when it comes to how do you build a team, and then how do you end up with a set of people who are playing to their strengths, who are inspired, who've been brought into a position for the very best reasons imaginable. And then, what kind of culture do you get on the back of that? Because everybody's literally playing to their best strength. So two really, really interesting examples. And just as you were talking, I realized that I'd forgotten an important element of this particular episode, which is completely unique. It's never happened before, but Paula Brockwell actually nominated you as her culture crush. So if anybody wants to go and find out why, go and check out that episode with Paula. It came out a couple of episodes ago. But yeah, so this is a world first. This is the first time ever that a culture crush has then come on the show as a guest. And I say it in almost every episode, like, if you hear this episode, person who's been mentioned, reach out and give me a shout. And I'm going to do it again right now. If somebody from Automattic or from SF Recruitment wants to come on the show and have a conversation with me, or maybe we can get Danny back on and we can have a conversation across the three of us, that would be amazing. But I just thought, hang on a minute, I've forgotten to announce the fact that you were that person nominated and then said yes to coming on the show. So thank you for being a world first, Danny. This is an amazing moment for us.
I've got a little bit of a blush on. I do have an orange blind in front of me, which is probably enhancing it, but that's lovely to be recognised by a peer. And Paula is fabulous. She's just a wonderful human being as well.
She really, really is. And yeah, I'm really enjoying getting to know Paula. So Paula, we're sending out some special, I was going to say special love. I'm not going to do
A
that.
virtual hug.
Yeah. Paula, we're sending you our very best. Big shout out to you. And thank you for bringing Danny to Culture Crush. You are so appreciated. Now, Danny, we love to get really, really practical on the show. We love to give leaders some things they can chew over and then do something about. Now, we've done a lot of that already. There's been some really, really interesting threads that we've been pulling on through this episode already. But I know that you've been thinking about a leadership challenge, which is very real right now, something you're experiencing in your work, and what leaders can do about it. So why don't you take those two kind of questions together? What's the leadership or culture challenge that you've been stewing on? And what are some of the actions that leaders can take around it?
The quick answer is there's a lot, isn't there? Being a leader is hard work. And the area that I've decided to focus on, and it kind of ties in with my academic research as well, is around organizational complexity. In the 18 and 1900s, our org structures were very hierarchical, very simplistic. And as a result, a lot of our leadership studies link to those models really well, whether it's old school kind of trait theory, or whether it's contingency theory, or whether it's charismatic theory or servant leadership. They all fit really well into simple hierarchies. But the challenge is today's organizations are really quite matrixed. It's not unusual for somebody to have multiple lines of reporting lines based on the work and responsibilities they have. And some of these older leadership styles don't quite fit because of the complexity of our organizations. And it's not a new phenomenon. McKinsey wrote about this in 2010. And there's also the London School of Economics wrote about it in 2005, that the impact of the complexity means that many of our processes and our approaches move like molasses. And in business, when anything is moving slowly, it's expensive. You don't necessarily have the insight into your customers, or that information isn't getting from A to B to where it's needed in time, which puts you at a disadvantage competitively. Companies that are overly complex also find it difficult to adapt. And when you have things, you have technological advances, whether it be the internet through to AI, that mean that standing still is moving backwards now, then you're at a disadvantage already compared to some of these more agile businesses. So that organizational complexity that's kind of driven by traditional thinking about what leadership is in terms of hierarchies. So is it situational context? Is it Steve is my boss and Sarah is her boss kind of structures? And my research has looked into what is it that a leader actually does. There's all these theories. We've got hundreds of different theories. Stockdale said there's almost as many theories of leadership as there are people that have attempted to define it. And that was in 1967. We've had a lot more that have come along since. But they all share three things in common. First is, a leader is always a person, which sounds silly, but we'll come back to that one in a moment. The second is that they set the direction. Now, whether that's a specific goal or whether it's a more of a vision, a kind of aspirational view that we're going for, well, they set the direction of where we're heading. And the third is they kind of set the rules of engagement in terms of the culture and why we should go in the first place. So my research asked, what if the direction was known and the rules of engagement were already agreed to? Do you need a person to be the leader, or can culture be the leader? And it sounds maybe a little out there, but there's lots of examples of this in nature. You know, if there was an earthquake where you are now, then people around you that may be young and fit might be out moving rubble and saving survivors. People that are medically trained might be tending to survivors. People that have great networks might be on their phone ringing, trying to get help. So nobody organized that. It's a self-organizing team centered around the common purpose, which is paramount, of we need to save lives. Can organizations do the same thing? This is what I've been looking at, and I've got some tips to kind of take on board. And there seems to be, the data suggests that it works particularly well in certain contexts. We're not getting rid of leadership completely, or traditional leadership completely. But there are situations where if the group of people, the team of people are all clear on what is that shared goal, and the team have the psychological safety and the perceived competency to perform, then they can be autonomous. They can bring all of their skills, not just what's in the job description, and contribute towards that shared goal. Yeah. There are, again, some examples in the real world. The Navy SEALs use this. So before a mission, they will have vertical leadership. So they'll decide who's on the squad, what's the objective, what weapons, etc. should we take. After the incursion, they have exactly the same thing. They'll have a debrief, what went well, what didn't, is anybody getting court-martialed, all of that sort of stuff. But whilst the incursion takes place, even though there is somebody that has the title of commander, actually the person that is best suited to that particular situation and context, leadership kind of molds and is fluid and dynamic. So it might be as they're approaching the beach, it's the logistics guy. When they reach the beach, it's the person that's great with landmines and ordnance. When they're approaching the premises, it might be the spotters and the snipers. Then it's the pointman as they get to the door. But nobody says, now it's your turn, or now it's your turn. It just happens because that's how we do things around here. The culture has become the leader because everyone's clear on why are we here.
Mm.
So in practical terms, how many organizations know why are we here? And then what are the behaviors, what are the reward mechanics, the communications strategy, etc.? Do they amplify that and support it? Or do we get in our own way because we're wedded to policies, protocols, whatever it might be that, we know they're not quite right, but they're ours and you're not touching them? Or have we ever really given it much thought that, well, we've always done it this way? So what's your thought? That's a lot of information of a completely new style of thinking when it comes to what leadership is and isn't. Any questions before I give some practical examples?
No, I think it's a really, really interesting and unusual point of view, right? Obviously, you've mentioned the Navy SEALs example. So there are examples of this in a professional context. And you talked about how we might respond as human beings in an emergency situation. And I was thinking about what does a rural village context look like, where you have different types of leaders within a community. You've got the school leadership, you've got the council leadership, you've got medical leadership, you've got the vets, you've got the minister, local minister, right? And each of these represent a sort of organic mesh or social function where there are different types of leaders at different points depending on what you need as a family at that time. And you wouldn't, go to the local church where you might want to deal with a pastoral challenge and then say, but the head teacher's opinion was this about my child's education. They might be completely separate issues, and you would go for one person for one type of advice and to another person for another type of advice, right? And so I think it's just really interesting to think about the position of leadership as something that can be fluid and dynamic and situational and not fixed, as we see in almost every workplace around the world. Mm-hmm. And again, I think it bumps into the language stuff that we were talking about before, that we're sort of wedded to hierarchical structures, and we use language like burnout or people are our best assets, or, all these kind of industrial age bits of language. Yeah. When we think about burnout, for example, and forgive me if I'm taking us on a tangent, but you've just kind of got my mind going.
We've done that the whole show, Dan. It's fine.
Yeah, exactly. But when you think about a word like burnout as an example, because it's such an extreme word and means you've literally ground to a halt, there's probably lots of people out there who are sort of at burnout all the time, but because they just haven't had an actual breakdown of some description, they sort of don't think they're burning out because they've been so trained to see, because it's such a kind of definitive and decisive word, that refers to something breaking, and you think, well, I haven't broken yet, so I can't really be suffering burnout, right? Like the word is preventing people from getting the help that they need, and it's a word that we've just kind of adopted into this working context. So I think it's a really interesting issue about why we don't have a more fluid sense of leadership and why we continue to be so wedded to this traditional hierarchy structure. Whereas, as you've pointed out, in nature, in places like the Navy SEALs, there are different ways you can do it. And there are ways, the data backs this up, that if you've got a known sense of direction and the rules of engagement are clear, teams can be released, given the liberty to operate in a more autonomous way.
We've kind of come full circle back to labels, in that burnout, having the label of burnout, some people will want that. So actually burnout is a medical condition, it's a recognized medical condition. I'm just overly tired and I'm exhausted, therefore I'm burnout. Or there'll be other people that actually are at that point that don't want to admit it because they don't want the label. So it's interesting that we've come full circle, because the language does matter. Semantics do matter. On the subject of leadership, though, it's really strange that I find it really strange that we've always had leaders, yet the word leadership didn't appear in the dictionary until 1821. And we didn't start studying it academically until the 1850s, 1860s. So all of our kind of theories around what good leadership is have all kind of grown up through the Industrial Revolution and through the mills of the 1800s and the production mines of the 1900s. And my whole premise for Constellation Leadership is, instead of it being that hierarchy, it's how do you create, everybody is a star in their own right. Everybody is an expert at something if you let them be. How do you create the right group of experts to solve a particular challenge, a particular problem, or achieve a particular goal? It doesn't mean it's suitable for all situations all of the time, as no leadership is. But there's plenty of examples that this is how we behave naturally when we're not forced into a kind of production line, mill kind of mindset. And the data shows that it does seem to work in certain contexts. Agile is a great example. An agile sprint has what we refer to as distributed leadership, but you have a leader, it's the scrum master. In the research, what would happen if you took, what are the conditions to take the scrum master out and the scrum still work? And actually those scrums outperformed other scrums that actually had a leader in, because we'd identified, we got the right people in the scrum with the right set of skills for this particular challenge or particular backlog that we're working through. They all understand how we get things done around here. And as a result, when things go wrong, they have permission to go and do things that are outside of their kind of normal job description or normal approaches as well. So I'm not evangelizing that Constellation Leadership is the right fit for every leadership theory every time, or every scenario every time, but where it is applicable, it outperforms traditional leadership really, really well by doing what we do naturally.
So I think some people are going to be having an aha moment watching this, reading this. People who kind of implicitly are in conflict with the way leadership is contextualized and conceptualized where they are, but can't really put their finger on why. Yeah. They're the kind of person who is perhaps seen as somebody who is rallying against the status quo, but because they don't have the kind of the theory, or they don't have the evidence that you've been talking us through, they're kind of stuck in that, I've got an instinct about this, but I don't know what to do about it. Yeah. And because I don't know what to do about it, I can't communicate clearly enough with those around me. So for those people having this aha moment right now, and they're having a sense of awakening, what can they do about it as leaders? Like, how can they practically engage with some of this stuff?
There are three main conditions that came out of the research in order to make this a success or not. The first is that goal needs to be known by all. And Organizations don't tend to be great at knowing why they do things. They know what they do, but they don't necessarily know what that actual aspirational vision is, what that North Star, where are we heading eventually. And being able to articulate that throughout your organization has also historically been a bit of a challenge. So we'll probably circle back to comms and comms governance at some point. But what is that North Star is the first thing. The second is really think about what are the behaviors, the skills, the attributes, whatever it is that's important to you, but what do you need to help you get closer to that? Do you recruit for those things? Do you communicate for those things? Do you recognize it when those things happen in your organization? And do you give permission, implicit or explicit, for people to do those behaviors? Okay. And the third thing is, surprisingly, org size gets in the way. So this was quite an interesting finding that in smaller organizations, people tend to wear more hats. If you've got an organization with 10 people and you've got one HR manager, the chances are that HR manager does employee relations, payroll, 2P, everything. Whereas if you have an organization of 1,000, you might have 5 people in HR and they all specialize in something. Now, one of the conditions was around trust and perceived competency. You would presume that where you have specialization with the 5 HR people, that you'd have more specialization and people would trust more. But actually the opposite becomes true, that once the org structure is over a certain size, people almost become anonymous. And that kind of Dunbar's number means that when orgs get over 100 to 150 heads, depending, then it may actually be advantageous to create silos. And that's something the armed forces do. You don't have companies in the army over 150 heads. That does create infighting. You know, the 107 doesn't like the 112 unless there is a battle to be had and then they've got each other's backs. So org size is potentially a blocker, but having that North Star and unleashing your people and having the psychological safety and the trust that they can bring all of their unique abilities, those are kind of the keys to making any leadership work. It just so happens it works particularly well with Constellation Leadership. And the key really is communication. What are you communicating? And more importantly, why are you communicating? There are so many things that get sent out in organizations that are content with no context. Let's just tell everybody everything. Well, no, you're just muddying the water. So it might mean that you have to put more thought into this one piece of communication that actually is going to 4 or 5 different audiences, or really that should be 4 or 5 different communications tailored for what does it mean to me. And it takes more work and it takes more upfront, but if it's tied to that North Star of why are we here, it makes complete sense to individuals. They then feel that they have the autonomy, the status, the ability, and the permission, which is the important thing, to contribute towards that North Star.
Danny, such depth, so interesting, and some really tactile things for people to take away and think about. And we usually finish it. So I get the audience to lean in, I get you to lean in and say, look, what's the one thing that people should take away and try? But I think we've already captured that there, that piece around communication and thinking through how do you apply that sense of North Star and the sense of those rules of engagement, but bring that right back down to, but how can I communicate this? Like how, if I've got that as an idea and a concept and something I want to do, how am I going to communicate that with people? And I think that's a really, really great place for us to land.
A good approach to take away. What do you need the audience to do differently after they've engaged with the con? And if it's nothing, do not send a con. So what do you need the audience to do differently after they've engaged with the communication? Do you need them to know something and recall something, feel a certain way? If it's not, then it's probably a vanity project. It's probably unrelated. It doesn't drive any action or behavior. Don't need it. Saying no is the most important thing in comms governance.
What a great place for us to finish. As I said, we are coming into land. And Danny, thank you for being the first ever Culture Crush nominee to then come on the show and have a conversation with me. I do hope that it'll be the first of many, because it's been such a fascinating conversation. So I'll have to see if I can twist your arm to join me again in future. But that is, unfortunately, all the time that we have for today's episode. Danny, thank you so much for making some time for the show, and let's speak again soon.
It's been a privilege. Thank you for gifting some of your time to me, Dan.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. If you've enjoyed your time with us, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening from. And if you're a culture first leader, be sure to visit anthem.oo because we've got lots in common. See you next time.